Hi, I'm Madeline James, and today we are going to be talking about the sword and sorcery subgenre of fantasy. This video is part of a collaboration with Nicole Wilbur and a collection of other author tubers. I will link the full playlist and Nicole's channel in the description below, and I highly encourage that you check them out. So before we get into it, I just want to say that I am absolutely not an expert and none of my advice should be taken as prescriptive. But I hope that me sharing some of my experiences and some of the things that I've learned will help you out if you're trying to get started. Let's start with how I define sword and sorcery and what makes it unique. The name, sword and sorcery, tells you two things. There is sword fighting and there is magic. But what is it that sort of sets this subgenre apart from genres like epic fantasy and high fantasy? Sword and sorcery is a fast-paced action genre with adventure and sword fighting and danger. But despite those life and death stakes, the scope and overall conflict in this subgenre is a lot smaller than in epics. Instead of the fate of the world, we're dealing with the struggles of our main characters. Instead of a battle between the forces of good and evil, we're dealing with the personal journeys of our characters and their desires and goals. There are definitely a lot of overlaps with high and epic fantasy and dark fantasy and other subgenres. But the focus here is different. At its root, sword and sorcery is about character. You rarely see common hero types that are perfectly selfless. The characters we follow in sword and sorcery are complicated and morally ambiguous. They have flaws and vices and goals that aren't exactly heroic. These characters are motivated by revenge, greed, love, hatred, power, and loneliness, or some combination of these. The settings are smaller in scale, more intimate, and we see them from a darker perspective. These stories don't focus on the beauty and goodness of civilization, but the shadows left by more righteous tales. Society itself is painted in shades of gray: corruption, violence, blood, pain, but also passion, love, and beauty. Sword and sorcery is a rich exploration of complicated characters, the dynamic arcs they go through, and their struggles in a world that is every bit as gray as they are. And these high-stake action plots are held together by character conflict, internal growth and struggles, and romantic subplots. Some of the more common plot tropes in sword and sorcery fantasy are heist plots, revenge quests, rescue missions, quests for knowledge, survival, and redemption. And the worlds are normally medieval-inspired or even earlier. Some traditional examples of this genre are Robert E. Howard's Conan the Barbarian, C. L. Moore's Geralt of Jory, and Jerzy Sapkowski's The Witcher. And I know I didn't pronounce that right. But in modern times, you can see a lot of elements of sword and sorcery in a lot of other books. The Greenbone Saga by Fonda Lee is a really good example of this. It's also an urban political fantasy, and it's maybe a little bit more slower paced at times than sword and sorcery is, but you don't get much more morally ambiguous characters and settings than you do in her books. The Wolf of Aran-Yarrow by K.S. Veloso is also a really good example. It's an action-packed story that has a lot of overlaps with sword and sorcery. Our main character here is flawed, but also very interesting. The world is dark and gritty, and the plots are very complex. And even Fourth Wing has action, adventure, sword fighting, magic, romance, great characters and settings. You see elements of this everywhere, so I think it's pretty safe to say that sword and sorcery is in. So, why do I love to read and write in this genre? One of the first reasons is I love sword fighting. It is actually a hobby of mine. And I love seeing complex characters dealing with these very physical external struggles. The tension that you get from the life and death fights. Another one of my favorite aspects is romance. I love romantic subplots. And while it's rarely the dominant plotline in these kinds of stories, I love the tension and the character development that it really brings. It helps keep me turning the pages and caring if the characters live or die in these very action-focused scenes. But I think my favorite thing is how complex and morally ambiguous the characters are. They are flawed, they are dealing with a lot of baggage, and they make a lot of mistakes. They may be darker and more violent than us normal people, but they're very relatable, and they just feel so real. They're fighting against their magic and sword-wielding enemies as much as they are fighting with themselves. You can dive so deep into the complicated nature of these people and the complex dynamics that they create with the people around them. And the worlds are the same way. They are complicated and dark, with jagged edges. They are corrupt and dangerous, and from a world-building perspective, this is a lot of fun. You get to focus a lot more on depth than breadth, such as you do with epic fantasy worlds. So what are my go-to resources for Sword and Sorcery Fantasy? So if you want to write in this genre, there are a number of resources that I find particularly helpful, and I'm going to list all of these in the description below. So Sword and Sorcery is an action genre with fast-paced plots. Some of my favorite resources for this part would be Mastering Suspense, Structure and Plot by Jane K. Cleland, and this one is particularly good because it talks a lot about how to get pacing and how to achieve this with TRDS, twists, reversals, and dangers, and she has a lot of really cool plotting maps for how to achieve this, and I highly recommend this for trying to achieve that more fast-paced plot. The next book I really like, which I actually read fairly recently, is Action by Robert McKee, and also Basim El Wakil. And you'll notice that I have a lot of Robert McKee's books in this list because I really like them. I will say they're a lot more complicated and more in depth. So if this is like your first craft book, I wouldn't start with his books, but they're very good. And this one is focused specifically on the action genre, and I really enjoy it. And then the next is his first book, Story by Robert McKee, which is all about story and structure and how to do all of those things in a way that makes them make sense and makes them moving forward, because you can have a ton of action scenes that don't really matter and no one's going to want to read them. So I really like Story, which I think you can tell by all of my little tabs here. So next is sword fighting and general action scenes from that perspective. And I think this is one of the things that a lot of people really struggle with because it's not something that most people have any experience with personally, and they're very difficult scenes for a lot of people, including myself, to write. I like to write a lot of historical documentaries on sword fighting and real battles and real, medieval battle strategy. And I also read a lot of historical sword fighting manuals, both because I really like them from a research perspective, but also because I do historical sword fighting. So some of the books that I like, this is a good general starter one called Medieval Swordsmanship, Illustrated Methods and Techniques by John Clements. And this one has actually a lot of information in it on things that aren't just about doing the sword fighting yourself. There's a lot more historical stuff in here about the types of armors and when they did different things and why they wore different types of armor and used different types of weapons, which is a lot more than just this is how you do this one style of sword fighting. So I definitely recommend this if you are only going to get one sword fighting manual type book. And then there's just a lot of random ones that can kind of show you the breadth of different styles and ways that sword fighting can be used. There's this fencing manual by Joshua Meyer, The Art and Practice of Fencing by Capoferro, The Flower of Battle, which is very cool. It's actually like, let me get to the actual book part, but it's like the actual manual from back then with just English kind of put in place of the original text. Very, very cool if you're a historical nerd like me. There's Iberian Swordplay by Godinho, The Duel or the Flower of Arms by Marazzo. And there's a lot of books that are just focused on, like, for writers, how to write fight scenes. The only one I actually have is Writing Fight Scenes by Rayne, and they have a very large series of different types of books, and I haven't gone back and read this after actually learning about sword fighting, so I don't know if necessarily how this holds up, but when I read it originally, it was pretty helpful for me. So the next thing is the gray and morally ambiguous characters and settings. And my best recommendation for this is there are a lot of videos by Fonda Lee on YouTube, and she's done some workshops on character, and I really, really, really recommend these. I will link some of the ones that I can find down below, but I know a lot of the workshops are at conferences and stuff like that, so if you ever get the opportunity to attend one of these, I highly recommend it. So then for writing dynamic character arcs in general, one of my favorite books is Story Genius. And this has a lot of plotting in it too. I don't go back to it for the plotting, but it has a beginning section on how to set up basically your character arcs, and it has you really dive down into why your character is the way they are, really setting it up for it to feel like when you start there's already this tumble of inevitability into their internal struggle, which absolutely love this book. It's by Lisa Cron if you haven't seen it. And then the other one that I really like is Character by Robert McKee. And again, this is pretty in-depth and complicated, but I really like it. There's a lot of really, really helpful information in here, a lot of different ways to balance out your cast. There's a lot of cast design stuff in here in general, a lot of stuff about making dynamic characters, making complicated characters, and stuff like that. So then the next section is sort of medieval worlds, which a lot of Sword and Sorcery is sort of inspired by from a world building perspective, and then world building in general. So two of the books I have that are specific for sort of medieval times would be the Time Travel's Guide to Medieval England, and this is by Ian Mortimer. And this is very good. It's sort of just taking you through medieval England and what it's like, what you'd see, the society, the setting, the landscape, just a lot of stuff that's very helpful. And obviously, if you're writing historical books set in medieval England, this is extremely helpful, and there's a lot of other books for that sort of a perspective. But it can just sort of give you a look into a time that is less technologically advanced than ours and sort of set you up in that right mindset so that when you do your world building, you have a bit of a starting point. And then I also have a writer's guide to the Middle Ages, which is good from a similar perspective, and this is specifically the British Isles from 500 to 1500, and it is by Sherrilyn Kenyon. Again, a lot of these books are very Europe focused, and I think that while you do see a lot of Sword and Sorcery that is very Europe focused, I think that it's really important to pull a lot of world building inspiration from other places around the world and different cultures. So while I don't have any like writer's guide style books to that I've been able to find, I would love some if anyone has any recommendations. But I do like to read a lot of books that kind of cover the sort of culture and history of these times in different places around the world. These aren't, a full expansive list or specifics, but just to get a couple examples. I have Destiny Disrupted, which is sort of a view of the world through Islamic eyes, and this is by Tamim and Ansary. I have The Secret History of Mongol Queens, about the daughters of Genghis Khan, and this is by Jack Weatherford. And I have A Brief History of Japan, which is by Jonathan Clements, and this is a very cool story of like samurai and the shogun and Zen and that sort of a thing, and this is a good one. And then lastly, from a world building perspective, I really like Hello Future Me's channel. He does a lot of on writing and world building videos that really deep dive into a lot of world building areas that I find really interesting. And he also has a series of books that sort of covers those same topics but are a little bit more in depth, and I think he put some extra stuff in here. So there is Volume 1, Volume 2, and the recently released Volume 3. And these are very cool. You can sort of see from the back that they sort of cover a lot of different topics, but death in the afterlife, sitting in towns, mountains, island civilizations, fallen civilizations. This is a lot of different ones about like world history, monarchies, wealth and power. That video on class, wealth, and power is particularly good. So is the section in the book too. And this one has a lot of stuff about empires and stuff in it. So I just highly generally recommend his books and his YouTube channel for a lot of that sort of stuff. So let's move on to some of the misconceptions and the mistakes I made when I was really first looking into this genre and sort of how I found worked for me to overcome them. So if you Google what Sword and Sorcery is traditionally and what this genre has sort of been in, the many previous decades, you will find that it's kind of sexist and is really only written by men. You would typically see barbarian type men fighting battles against evil sorcerers who, were frequently women, and other women were like sexy damsels in distress that were pretty flat characters. And it can be tempting to think that this is all this genre is and that this genre hasn't and isn't evolving. So I like to take a much more modern approach to this genre. And I think a lot of popular fantasy shows and books these days show that you don't have to be a man to write in this genre, and you don't have to write about, overly macho stereotypes. There's a lot of potential here. I think when writing in any genre, you really have to focus on the elements that appeal to you. So focusing on the darker, grayer worlds, focusing on the character dynamics and the complex, morally ambiguous characters, and having these like really cool action plots and weaving in magic. That's what makes this genre really good. Another mistake I made originally was not really going deep enough into these stories. You might think that something that is so fast-paced, that is an action genre, really doesn't need to get that in-depth with the characters and their backgrounds and their internal struggles, but that is, I have found, really not the case here. It is the depth of the character and the worlds that make these stories work, that make you care about this fast-paced action. So learning that early on and being prepared for that, I think really helps. So what is my advice for someone that wants to get started in this genre? I think this advice applies to everything, but if you want to write sword and sorcery, I think you need to consume a lot of this genre. And it doesn't have to just be books. Find darker action stories in movies, video games, comics. Look for morally gray settings and characters and really pay attention to the characters. To write in this genre, you really need to understand character and you really need to understand action. And you can find a lot of these elements in epic and dark fantasy too. Watch and read some traditional examples, like The Witcher and Conan the Barbarian. Play Assassin's Creed games. Pay attention to the characters and their motivations in Game of Thrones. Read the Greenbone saga and really analyze each of the different settings and the characters and what makes them gray. Watch the first few seasons of The 100 and pay attention to the growth of these characters and how it changes the dynamics between them as they change. And then read a lot of craft books. Watch sword fighting videos on YouTube. Take a martial arts class. Find a way to make the action make sense to you. And then really lean in and focus on the elements that you find the most fun. But I hope you've enjoyed this chat about my experience with Sword and Sorcery Fantasy. And if you have any thoughts or questions, I'd love to hear about them down below. I'm always learning and improving and looking for more ways to do so. It's kind of a never-ending journey. But before you go, if you haven't checked out the playlist for the collaboration, I highly suggest that you go do so and watch the other videos in this series. The link is in the description below. But thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next one.